Hi, I'm Omega from Cult of the Dead Cow.
And this is the Deth Vegetable, Minister of Propaganda for Cult of the Dead Cow, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Gary Parker, and today we have episode 336 for August 8th, 2023. By the time you hear this, I will be in sunny Las Vegas, Nevada, going there for Hacker Summer Camp. I'll start off with B-sides, maybe slip into Black Hat, we'll see, but really mostly going for DEF CON 31. Super psyched. Cannot wait to get there. It's going to be so fun. And in honor of that, today I have got an interview with two original old school OG hackers from one of the oldest hacking groups on the planet called the Cult of the Dead Cow. And you might be wondering where they got that name. Well, that is one of the questions I will be asking our two guests. We have Omega and we have Deth Veggie. And of course, these are their hacker handles. And I will be asking them where they came up with those names. And we're going to reminisce a lot. I wanted to kind of, because these guys go way back with hacking, I wanted to talk about like pre-internet hacking, like way back in the day, back when phone phreaking was the thing. And that's PHREAK, freak. That is what you do when you want to make free long-distance phone calls, basically. Or in some cases, like free local phone calls from a pay telephone booth, which nobody sees anymore. If you're not old enough, you probably don't even know what the heck that is. It was a very, very different time back then. And before we had ubiquitous broadband, even before we had internet, the way you interacted with people using computers and long-distance communications was very different. So we're going to reminisce a lot about that and have some fun talking about what it was like growing up in that environment, what some of the hacker groups were like and how they interacted with each other, because there's all sorts of stories about, hacker wars and things like that were kind of blown out of proportion. Turns out a lot of these groups actually intermixed a lot. There was a lot of overlap between some of these groups, which is to say that the membership wasn't exclusive. A lot of times people were in multiple groups. But the coolest thing for me about the Cult of the Dead Cow, or CDC for short, and I've just read the book by Joseph Menn about the Cult of the Dead Cow, which makes this perfect timing, is that the CDC guys were really about the free flow of information, anti-censorship, and into hacktivism. In fact, they coined the term hacktivism. So we're going to be talking about that today as well. And I'll ask them, what is it that makes somebody a hacker? Because I firmly believe that we all have some hacking tendencies. And I think the term hacking kind of gets a bad name, but think about things like life hacks, right? I mean, these are things that we do. They're kind of tricks, right? There are ways of figuring out how something works and figuring out a way to do it better. So we're going to get into all that today. We had a really great talk. Just a couple quick lingo things I want to throw out. We're going to talk about BBSs, or bulletin board systems. We will actually explain what that is in the show. We mentioned, I think, IRC, Internet Relay Chat. That's kind of an early instant messaging kind of a thing. It's still around, by the way. We're going to talk a lot about text files today, especially when references to bulletin boards. And all of this was maybe a precursor to what we're more used to with like Usenet, if you know what that is, or, even web forums today. Now, there is a little bit of cursing in this. And actually, it's because one of the hacker handles actually has a curse word in their name. So be prepared for that. All right, with all that as a precursor, let's get to our really fun interview with Deth Veggie and Omega from the Cult of the Dead Cow. Today, we've got a really, really special show for you. I'm going to be interviewing two members of one of the oldest hacker groups on the planet called the Cult of the Dead Cow. And with us is Deth Veggie, or Deth Vegetable, a.k.a. Luke Benfi. Welcome to the show, Luke.
Hey, nice to be here.
And we also have Omega, a.k.a. Michael, or Misha Kubeka. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Guys, I'm so looking forward to this. This is great. And with the Hacker Summer Camp coming up, and I've actually just finished reading the book on the Cult of the Dead Cow, which was great. And so it was perfect timing. We actually we read it as part of our book club for the patrons. And so it's fresh in our minds, and this is really going to be a lot of fun. So for my audience's sake, who probably has no idea, I mentioned to my mom earlier today that I was going to be interviewing two folks from the Cult of the Dead Cow. And she said, Cult of the Dead Cow? ? Like, what the hell is that? So please, one of you explain, what is the Cult of the Dead Cow? How does it start? And I'd love to know where the name came from.
It's the hacking group that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
Yeah, there are some people that say that CDC is just the modern incarnation of an ancient Gnostic order that, with its roots in ancient Egypt, with worship of Hathor, the cow goddess. Others might tell you that CDC has always been and will always be a sort of universal constant, if you will. However, those people are all wrong. CDC got its start in 1984 in Lubbock, Texas. A group of sort of like punk kids who were maybe like, I'd say probably about 12, 13 at that point.
Oh, wow.
And, they were sort of social outcasts, skaters, kind of, people who didn't really fit in with this sort of, not rural Texas, but agricultural Texas sort of environment. And, the truth is what you got to say, because they used to hang out at an abandoned slaughterhouse. And so, that was their place. So they started referring to themselves as the cult of the dead cow. And then that kind of translated into, once they, one of them set up a BBS and they started, had an online community that was then sort of translated into the wider world as people outside of their friend group in Lubbock, got involved and things like that.
So I think I would add that, CDC has a lot of amazing firsts. We invented the hackerspace, L0pht in New Hack City. We invented the Modern Security Conference, HoHoCon. We're the first gender integrated hacking group, the first hacking group to have its own Usenet news group. If people in your audience still don't know what Usenet is,
Right.
We coined the term hacktivism. CDC produced the first hacker congressman, the first member of Congress who is a former hacker, and the first hacker presidential candidate. But so, we're known for a lot of firsts, but probably three things that people know us about. One is electronic publishing and distribution of over 450 text files, mostly in the pre-internet of the 80s and the 90s. Secondarily, back orifice and BO2K, and hacktivism. CDC is considered a hacking group today, but we didn't really start out that way. We started out as a group that wrote 7-bit ASCII text files. Joe Menn famously called us the liberal arts wing of the computer hacker underground, and in many ways we still are.
I know that, that was for a while we were sort of collecting quotes by people about CDC, and one of my favorite ones was Bruce Sterling, who called us I think he referred to us as the termites in the foundation of the status quo. And I think someone else, was it Gilmore? Maybe it was Gilmore that called us, said that we were like the smartest kids on the short bus to school, which I just find that really amusing.
So were you guys, at what point were you getting into computer stuff? Did the Cult of Dead Cow, at that point of the creation of the group, were you actually, hacking around at that time, or did that come later?
So this predates either of us being in CDC.
Right, sure.
I was inducted in 1990, and I think Omega 91, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And so it had already been a going concern for 6 years by the time I joined, but I was certainly aware of it from when I was first sort of online. And by online in this case, I mean using a modem to call BBSs.
Right.
And so I think it was one of these things where when it originally started out, it was just these three guys, founded by three guys in Lubbock, three kids. And then, their friends started calling from in Lubbock. And then, it kind of spread out wider. They started publishing text files. And that's how it originally got sort of low F, small F famous in a very small subset of society. Because text files would go everywhere. It was a format that would be spread around to other BBSs all over the world. And so people would learn about it and say, oh, what is this Cult of the Dead Cow? I need to find out more of it. And I'm going to, maybe there's some phone numbers of their BBSs on this text file. I'm going to call these phone numbers. And that's how I first called CDC BBSs, and certainly how I first learned about CDC's existence was through text files. And Omega, I think you said the same, thing. It's, one of these things that I became aware of its existence long before I actually spoke to, or, had any conversation even on a BBS with somebody who was part of it.
Yeah. Text files were sort of the currency of the realm, especially in the computer underground.
You would use it to. I was just going to say that we'd use it to share information, because there was certainly no web chat, there was no IRC, or even a little bit later there were some things, sort of not proto IRC, but pre IRC chat things on Telenet and TimeNet, but that's not how people were disseminating information. It was being done mostly on BBSs. To a lesser extent, sometimes people would meet up in person. Later on, there would be teleconferences, especially using hacked phone cards.
Yeah.
Which is actually, that's the way I got invited to join CDC originally, is that I had been, I was on these BBSs and I, was a fan certainly, but I started setting up these alliance teleconferences for CDC members to talk to each other. And it didn't take long for them after that to kind of, invite me in as a member, which obviously I was very, very flattered.
You had the codes.
Yeah. I had the codes. Codes. Man, it's like being invited to join the Beatles, but
All right. So you've talked about BBS as a tech file. So let's get into this a little bit. So first of all, BBS is short for bulletin board systems. And this is pre-internet. This is before the World Wide Web. This is before AOL discs were showing up in your mailbox. Mm-hmm. This was pre-web. And so for you guys to talk back in the day, and we talked about this a little before the show, I'm just bummed that for as much as I was into this kind of, computers a little bit at the time and things, I totally missed out on this. I just I was not part of the whole BBS scene. And it just bums that I missed that. But so we're talking about phone calls to dedicated computers. Well, you know what? You guys could explain it better than me. Explain to the audience, what is BBS? How did it function? Like when you wanted to communicate, what did you do? And what were these text files that you speak of?
Yeah. So, BBS is a computer bulletin board, right? And the only way you could get to it was by, having a modem, right? So a modem translates between digital data and analog data, right? So that you can transmit over a telephone line, right? So frequently it would be the case where, you're a hobbyist and you want people to visit this computer bulletin board that you've set up, right? So you would run it on a dedicated computer in your bedroom with a phone line plugged into a modem connected to your computer. And, just like ordinary landlines, you can only receive one call at a time, right? So I think kind of an analogy for today is, imagine Reddit, right? So there's many subreddits. You can find a subreddit that interests you and, you can read posts from other people. But imagine that only one person could read or write on Reddit at a time, right? And so like if they have their browser open and they're on Reddit, nobody else could be on Reddit, right? Until they close the browser window. And then somebody else could get on Reddit and start reading or posting, right? So that's kind of what the BBS experience was, right? There was generally BBS only had one phone line, so it could only have one user on at one time. And if that person was on for hours and hours, you had to redial over and over and over until you could get in, right? And just to go back to text files for a minute, text files are really, they're about telling stories to others in our community. In this case, the computer underground. And the only way you could read these text files was if you had a computer, a modem, and you knew the right telephone number to dial, right? Because a particular, a text file that you might want to read, or a group that was writing text files that interested you, these were published on a particular BBS. You couldn't just dial any BBS and read Cult of Dead Cow text files, right? You'd have to dial a BBS that was run by the Cult of Dead Cow, or somebody who was a fan of the Cult of Dead Cow downloaded all the text files from a CDC BBS and put them up on their BBS. Right?
We actually had a network of that. It was called the K Cow Force, where it was like join the K Cow Force. Essentially, you were saying, I have a BBS and I am going to distribute every new text file that comes out of CDC. And that was something that I don't think anybody else had done. And to some extent, yeah, exactly. And I think that sort of started to spread spread notoriety. But one other thing I wanted to mention, as far as like, there's only one person that can use a BBS at a time, is also there is a live chat function, but it's just you trying to talk to the sysop, the guy who's running it, and maybe he's there, maybe he's not. But it was, the other thing about it, the idea of it being a dedicated a dedicated computer and or dedicated phone line is that, especially back then, you got to remember the kids are like 12, 13, 14. And so if you look at old text files, saying, hey, call my BBS, a lot, they will make a point of saying like, we're 24 hours a day, or maybe they're not 24 hours a day. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're only open from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. or whatever, because it's like, otherwise, mom's got to use the phone or whatever. I remember actually Drunk Fucks, CDC member Drunk Fucks, he had it was a satirical or a joke advertisement for his BBS, but it was like online from 3 p.m. when we get home to 5 p.m. when moms get home.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Well, I think we're of an age. Back when I was a kid, we actually, at my house, not only did we have just one phone line, because most people only could afford one or would only pay for one. There was one line for the house.
Yeah.
And we actually at some point had a party line. So it was shared with other people's houses, so that you couldn't even make a call when you wanted to. So that could have potentially been part of the reason I was not part of this thing.
Or call waiting.
Oh, sure. There's no call waiting. There's no caller ID. And modems, if you're of a certain age, you might think, oh, modems. Yeah, that's that little, maybe the card you bought that goes in your PC. And I'm like, no. The original modems were taking the AT&T standard Bakelite handset into a acoustically coupled suction cup thing, that where
we used
you
to
guys.
call them earmuff modems.
Right. Yeah, well,
and another thing to keep in mind is that modems were not cheap. I mean, I don't know about Misha, but I had one because my dad worked in the tech industry, and he would. That's the same way we had computers at home. Once we got past the original ones, we talked a little bit about like the TI 99.4A and the Coleco Atom and things like that. But I know that when he brought back the first sort of like PC, essentially, it was something that he'd gotten from work. And same with the modem. And it was this would have been for me 1980. For the modem, it was 86. And I actually don't remember how I found the first BBS I ever called, but I do know that my introduction to sort of the computer underground, if you will, was like going to visit my cousins in California. I grew up in sort of a rural area outside of Boston, but we'd gone to California to visit my cousins, and I remember getting this floppy disk from them. And this floppy disk was full of text files that at that point were a couple years old. So they were probably, early to mid 80s. And it was just like this, boom, there's this whole world out here that I had no idea about. But like, these are interesting people that I feel like I fit in with in a way that I do not fit in with the jocks and what at my school. And it was very much this sort of epiphany that there is an entire community of people like me out there that I feel like I would fit in with. It's, my grandmother used to have the expression that she used on me and my friends, but she called us smarty weirdos. And so it's like, those are my people, man, the smarty weirdos. And they always have been.
Yeah, something I would point out about text files is that besides CDC, most text files were nonfiction, right? Most of the text files that you found were often about hacking or phreaking or something, right? And in fact, this was how you made your reputation as an elite hacker, right? You figured something out, or you synthesized something from something else you read, and you wrote your own text file about it, describing, how to do a particular thing, right? And and slapped your handle on it, your pseudonym on it, right? And maybe at the bottom you put a footer about, the BBSs where you could download more files from me, the writer, right? So, the majority of these kinds of text files that we would read about, again, they're very technical. They're about, they're about hacking and they're written by hackers. But the founders of CDC were not elite hackers. They were, as Luke said, they were just a bunch of teenagers living in a dead-end cow town in Texas who wanted to be heard, I think. And, I think the original members in particular, they liked to poke fun at themselves and also the computer underground elite, right? So a lot of the early CDC text files are,
parodies, and
they're parodies in one way or another of a some technical kind of file. I mean, CDC published a text file on how to build a gerbil feed bomb, which is both silly and hilarious, how that would even work. they wanted to be heard. They wanted to publish something. They're not elite hackers. What do? They're publishing Metallica lyrics. They're, publishing these parody text files, right? And their text files were, irreverent and sarcastic and that spoke to my sense of humor. So I had when I first encountered CDC's text files, I had a kind of an experience like Luke did, where it was like, hey, these are my people, right? These people are writing fiction, or they're writing things they're totally not about technical stuff, although that's really interesting. I like collecting those files and reading those too, but this is something that's completely different, and it speaks to me, since from the beginning, CDC has specialized in irony and hyperbole and just this sort of irreverent, sarcastic sense of humor. And, we kind of infuse everything we do with that, not just the things that we write.
Yeah, I think that's an important differentiator. I know that you kind of mentioned talking about this later on, but a differentiator for CDC versus a lot of these other groups is that from the very beginning, we never took ourselves too seriously, and we never took the hacker scene that seriously. And I think I speaking for myself, I definitely personally have a gut reaction against people who I think are taking themselves too seriously, or I find, arrogant and things like that. So, and I've always been that way. And I think that as Misha says, that really spoke to me and attracted me. But it's also, I think, in the long run, I forget who it was, whether maybe it was, I don't remember who it was. Some journalist who referred to us as the clown princes of the hacker underground. Mm-hmm. And I think that can seem like it's a sort of derogatory or diminutive, pejorative. It could seem like it's a pejorative term, but I don't think it was. And I think in the long term, we found that it has not proven to be. I think that part of why CDC has been so successful in terms of being around for a long time and attracting people who are the right fit for it, is because we don't take ourselves too seriously, and that speaks to people. Yeah.
I mean, to this day, writing a text file is a requirement of membership in CDC. You have to be able to write something that's compelling and interesting. Yeah, I just remembered, so Michael Hoy was the publisher of Lumpanix Unlimited, which was an actual press that put out kind of underground books, if you will. He had a great quote. It was like, if it's illegal, immoral, or revolting, CDC has a file about it, and possibly 3 of them. And that's us.
Yeah.
There was an element, we were writing things that, to be funny or writing things to get the voice out there, but there was also especially, very early on, there was a culture of just trying to be outrageous and things, files like sex with Satan or bunny lust and things that are just kind of this over the top expression. Because again, teenage boys.
Right.
And, it's kind of the sort of thing that nowadays we'd call edgelording, except it wasn't mean. I never got the feeling that we were being mean or cruel. Or, certainly we said and did things that I would not say and do now, through the lens of, being 35 years older. Mm. But I don't think we were ever aiming to be, there was never hate in our hearts, and we never even pretended to be, we were never even being ironically cruel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I remember I was when I interviewed Jeff Moss a couple years ago, and he was talking about LOD and MOD and some of the early groups. I believe those are all gone at this point, right? L0pht, some of the guys are still around. So you mentioned it. So what differentiated you between those guys, and maybe how are you saying? I know there was a lot of overlap in some of these groups, but the reason I brought up Jeff was he said that there's a big feud between Masters of Deceptions and Legion of Doom. Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of infighting? What was their competition? What was the dynamic between the groups, and are any of them still around?
I think certainly the people are still around.
Sure.
Yeah. And I don't think that they hate each other anymore, except there are some exceptions where people are like, this person sent me to jail, sent me to prison, so
that'll do it.
Screw that guy. Yeah. Which I'm like, okay, fair enough. But by and large, it's one of these things where a lot of time has passed, and in hindsight, so many of these things that were squabbles, like through an adult lens, is like it was meaningless. It doesn't,
Right.
it totally doesn't matter. I also think that that this was sort of ginned up as like the hacker war, the hacker wars of the early '90s with LOD versus MOD, but it was really never that big a thing. It was people playing pranks on each other, basically. I mean, some of those pranks were good, like turning somebody's home phone into a payphone. So that when they tried to make a phone call, it would be like, please deposit 25 cents. Like, this is my phone at home, kind of thing. Because that's the kind of stuff you can do if you have access to the phone company's systems.
You change the class of service on the home phone.
Yeah. It's just a toggle.
That was a big part of the hacking back in the day, and I'm sure some of that was the fact that because these were phone numbers, and because a lot of these phone numbers were not local, you had to make long distance calls. And for those of us old enough to remember, long distance calls used to cost money, like a lot of money.
Oh yeah,
and so phone phreaking, PH phreaking, getting around that stuff was a big deal. And Captain Crunch, and that was a whole big part of the scene, right?
Man, that guy.
Yeah.
It definitely was. And I mean, again, that's even before I got involved with following the CDC. Like the way that I got involved with hacking and phreaking was I first of all, it's like a social thing. Like I'm calling these BBSs. This is interesting. I'm talking to people from all over, even in other countries or whatever. And then I talk about a little bit about this in Joe Men's book, but there was the day that my parents got a $600 phone bill and, they sat me down and were like, this will not happen again. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to stop calling these places. Right. So how do I do it for free? I think that's a story that is kind of, I don't think I'm alone in that sort of scenario.
Yeah. Learning to phreak was a necessity in a lot of ways. And I want to point out that long distance phone calls were very expensive back then.
Very expensive.
The people who are growing up now, millennials, Gen Z, phone calls are much less expensive or free in some cases, but they cost dollars per minute to make phone calls back then, right? And so, you live in I lived in a small town. I didn't live in a big metro area. And, there were a couple BBSs, maybe half a dozen BBSs in my local area. There was only one underground BBS, and that was because I ran it. there were no other ones, right? So if if you wanted to get content, get text files written by other hackers, learn other things, interact with other people who were interested in doing those things, you had to make long distance phone calls because all the interesting stuff was always happening in somebody else's area code, right? It was whatever area code you were in was usually not very interesting. You had to make those calls.
I think, I've never thought of it this way, but it sort of was like this area code lottery where it's like if you happen to live in a place that had this sort of stuff going on, you are much more likely to get involved. And that's why you get these sort of nexuses anyway, of areas where there was a hacker scene. So like Boston had an amazing one. There was one in New York, the MOD guys, that was a big place they came out of. Chicago had a big one. Obviously the Bay Area was a huge one. And I'm not being, exhaustive. There were other places as well, but that's how you get things like all these people that came out of Boston, like all the CDC people, the L0pht folks, and there were LOD people there, etc. Or, the Bay Area, even before CDC, there's a group called Anarchy Inc., which was one of the ones that actually influenced CDC early on. But it was a kind of the luck of the draw of where you happen to live.
Sure,
and also, and obvious, this is something that didn't occur to us back then, but there's also an inherently exclusionary aspect to this in that it's not just living in the right place. It's like having a computer and a modem, and who has computers and modems is overwhelmingly going to be, well off, generally white folks, especially back then, boys specifically. And so it's, we need to recognize that it was not like a true crosscut of society the way that in a lot of ways it is now. It was a bunch of, middle class and upper class white boys basically who were the ones that were had the privilege to be able to even know about this community, this stuff going on. And
so
I
hadn't really thought about it that way. But I totally get that. Looking back, I'm curious, what was the first time that you introduced yourself as a hacker? Do you have a memory of when you made that conscious decision and someone asked you, and maybe you introduced yourself with your hacker handle instead of your name?
In
was there a
person,
trend?
you mean?
Yeah, in person. Online, obviously, that's probably what you were, but in person, this was IRL. When did you kind of commit to that thing?
So, nowadays, well, I don't know. I guess they still do them, but certainly in the 90s, there was the idea of 2600 meetings. So 2600 magazine, which is a hacker and phone freaker magazine that's also been around since 1984.
Yeah, still around, yeah.
They would have, in various cities, they'd publish in the back. It's first Friday of the month, everybody meets here or there. But even before that, in Boston, the Works BBS, which was a BBS that I was a hostess up on and that I met Omega on for the first time, we would have what we called works gatherings. And so we'd go we'd be like, hey, this Friday we're going to go hang out at the pizza place in Harvard Square. And I would bet you money that would be the first place that I ever first introduced myself as Deth Veggie in a scenario like that, meeting people that's how I knew them online on the BBS is so you introduce yourself as your handle, because otherwise if I go up and say, hey, I'm Luke, they're like, who the hell are you? Kind of a thing.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it could be the same in my case. So I don't know if Luke did, but I had multiple handles depending on what I was doing, right? And so I had a BBS handle that had nothing to do with hacking, and I used it when I called BBSs that were not part of the computer underground.
What was that handle? Now it can be told.
These handles are too embarrassing to get into. But in any case, so I had introduced myself with some of those handles before, but I think the first time I introduced myself in real life as Omega was probably at one of these works gatherings. Yeah.
Or even before the works gatherings, I remember going over to Jason Scott's. So
yes.
the Works BBS. Some of your listeners may know Jason Scott, who from the Internet Archive and who runs textfiles.com. So the original incarnation of the Works was created by Jason Scott in I guess 86 or so in New York, maybe 88, but he 86 to 88. But we were sort of these teenagers, and he was in Boston in college because he was 2 or 3 years older than us, and he would have people over to his apartment to hang out, and that's how I first met, I think, anybody that I knew in what would now be the hacker scene is going and hanging out at Jason Scott's place.
Yeah. I have a very vivid memory of that. I think that was the first time I met you, Luke.
Yeah, I think
White
so.
Knight, and possibly Brian Oblivion.
I think Iskra also.
Oh, in Iskra, yeah. So we went to Jason Scott's apartment on Beacon Street in Boston. And I introduced myself to White Knight as Omega, and he introduced himself as White Knight. And we started talking. We realized that we knew each other by reputation. So he's like, are you the Omega who does this and this, who calls that board? Yes. Are you the White Knight who's on this BBS? Yes. And so that was kind of weird, realizing that not expecting to actually know this person that I was just introduced to, but then realizing that we knew something about each other, right? We had crossed paths without, and never expecting that we would meet in person. And here we were talking.
It's funny. You touched on something though there that's relevant for handles, is the discussion of are you the Omega that does this? Are you the White Knight that does that? Because
there was no national registry for handle names.
No, exactly. And so you'd have I'm White Knight 617. That guy's White Knight 303 or what have you.
Which were area codes, I assume.
Exactly. Area codes. Yeah. But that's how I ended up with a dumb name like the Deth Vegetable, is that I saw all these people that I called them the D&D handles. Everybody would pick a name that and it was just sort of this generic, either sci-fi or swords and sorcery kind of thing. And I was like, well, I want a name that nobody else is ever going to pick. So I will be the Deth Vegetable. And,
did it work out?
It did. Well, actually, what's weird is now there are other people who I mean, that have called themselves that, I assume after, encountering me online or whatever. But it's very strange if you search for the Deth Vegetable, if you Google it, there are people in there that are not me. But another CDC member, Tweety Fish, had exactly the same story. It was I want a name that nobody's going to pick. And so he was Tweety Fish.
Yeah, in our cases, we were often 13 or 14-year-olds trying
Sure.
on new identities to see which one.
Sure.
So you as a 13 or 14-year-old, you pick something menacing like the Deth vegetable,
Right.
or mysterious like Omega, and sometimes you just get stuck with it. So as an example, Dildog is another CDC member. His handle is a combination of Dilbert and Dogbert.
Oh, okay.
It was just a temporary handle he picked on a lark.
Sure.
But after a while, he this reputation built up around his handle because he was writing text files about it or doing things about it, right? And Dildog is the one who did this. Dildog is the one who wrote that, right? And after a while, this reputation had built up. He couldn't walk away from it, right? So to this day, he's still Dildog, even though I'm sure he wishes he had some other handle.
So, Luke, was the spelling of death for Deth Veggie, was that a call out to Megadeth? Because it's not
It
D-E-A-T-H.
absolutely was. Well done.
All right.
You're one of the only people who's ever recognized that. Yeah, I mean, I was a metalhead sort of headbanger punk kid, and so I remember I had a big Megadeth poster on my wall, and I was like, oh yeah, the Deth vegetable homage. One thing I wanted to mention, you talking about, because you were talking about Dildog, is an anecdote about Mudge. Is that Mudge's handle was just a friend of his last name. Like he had a friend whose last name was Mudge.
Really?
And the other good story about that is that also was not his first handle. He used to go by the Time Lord. Yes. And there's a funny story about like the first time we ever met Mudge in person at a works gathering. He was like, oh yeah, I'm Mudge. And we asked him, I was like, oh, you ever had any other handles? And he's like, oh yeah, I used to go by the Time Lord. And I remember Iskra like thinking about it for a second. He's like, Time Lord, like, you cracked Ultima 2 for the Apple II, Ultima 1 for the Apple II. And Mudge was like, yeah, well, actually my dad did, but but I put my name on it.
Classic.
Cracking was another form of hacking. In this case, it was deprotecting software, right? So back then, software came with DRM. It came with copy protection in order to keep you from copying it. But
don't copy that floppy.
A lot of us spent time, not just hacking computers or phreaking, but also deprotecting software, right? And so that you could pirate it. I did a lot of that. Yeah.
There was the whole story of like, even before we were thinking of it as hacking as such, BBSs would be known for two things: wares, W-A-R-Z, or pirated software, and codes, K-O or K0DEZ, which was hacked phone card numbers and things like that. And then, you could use those. I think that sort of these things were not separate from actually hacking into computers, but you also got to remember that in the days before the internet, hacking into computers meant literally doing what they did in war games, calling every single phone number in a prefix and seeing which one's computers answer to, and then calling them up and trying to break into them.
And there was a name for that. What?
War dialing.
Yes,
war dialing, named after war games. It's one of the two things that I can think of in the movie War Games that actually were real things.
What was the other?
Realistic. The other one is when he stops. He's like stranded out in the middle of nowhere, and he finds a payphone.
Yes.
And he goes and he screws unscrews the microphone, the mouthpiece off, and grounds it to the phone, and he's able to make a free phone call. And that absolutely worked. I used to use it with I would just I'd unbend a paperclip, and I'd poke it into the center hole of the mouthpiece, and then you'd ground it against the phone, and for whatever it would do, it would basically allow you to make a free local phone call. And so before red boxes, that was you could make a free local phone call.
And that's where 2600 got its name, the 2600 frequency, the 2600 hertz. That was the tone for making long distance calls that made
for blue boxes. Yeah. I came in just after, like, blue boxes. I didn't really work in the U.S. anymore by the time, because I got my start sort of like 88, 87, that kind of period, and they had already switched to electronic switching in this country. But in other countries, I think I pointed you at the unauthorized access documentary, and if I recall correctly, there's a piece where she's visiting somebody in a country where where you can still use those, and he demonstrates how it works.
Crossbar. Yeah. There were still old non-ESS5 switches. in different parts of the country. US. It took AT&T like years and years to roll out the new electronic switching system.
I mean,
so there were places where you could still do the kind of old school blue box phreaking.
I think people might not necessarily realize that when we talk about, they were upgrading their systems, this is not a software patch. It is a building full of mechanical devices.
Right.
Like literally a giant 8 or 10 story building that is full of these walls and walls of analog switches, electrical switches that are then being replaced with rack-mounted electronic switches.
Right, Starger switches. I was in telecommunications for most of my life, so when I was at Nortel, they did a little history of the telecom stuff. We got to see some of those that old style equipment. It was really amazing.
It's great to watch. I mean, there's videos of YouTube's like it is physically moving and switching, go ka-chunk, ka-chunk. It's stuff is fascinating.
Yeah, it's
steampunk seeming now. Like
right.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to take you back again. Back as you're going through this phase, was there, as you were growing up, like how did you tell your parents and or friends about this stuff? What was the kind of the vibe of saying you were a hacker? Was it kind of a closeted thing, like you had to come out at some point and say, yes, I'm a hacker? And then how do you think the perception of hackers and hacking has changed since you were kids?
Well, for me, it was definitely like a sort of closeted thing. At first, I definitely didn't share that with my parents. I think, they kind of figured stuff. Certainly that something was going on when I'd be up all night on the computer, because that's when nobody would call and knock me offline or what have you. But I can't remember how it first, if there was a moment where it was like, Mom, Dad, I'm a hacker or anything like that. But yeah, I don't know. I've never asked them about that, like when they kind of figured it out or what. But that's kind of I should ask them. But definitely there was a negative stigma attached to it. Then I mean, both from socially and just like, oh, you're a nerd kind of a thing, but also there was this idea in the popular press and certainly amongst law enforcement that a hacker was necessarily a criminal, was somebody who is either destroying things or stealing things or breaking things. And for the vast majority of us, I mean, that was not our goal. And it was essentially the reason that we were breaking into things was twofold. First, because we wanted to learn, and as a 12-year-old kid in rural Massachusetts, nobody's going to give you access to a big and therefore interesting computer system.
Right.
So if you want to get into one, you have to break into it, and that's how you learn about it. But also, we were never trying to break those systems or delete things, because then they'd close the door. You wouldn't be able to use it anymore. Yeah, it's ironic. You might break things accidentally, but
it's ironic the way hackers and hacking was portrayed in the press back then. Because generally, we, as Luke said, we had a credo, right? That there was such a thing as the hacker ethic. And there's
freedom of information.
There's a very famous text file written about it. But generally, we were there to learn. We were there to explore. We're, doing things in pursuit of knowledge. And it's true that some of that knowledge society considered illicit, but, we were not there to destroy anything. And contrast that with today. We have organized cybercrime. We have ransomware. We have cyber stalking, right? Yeah. So, I'm still having a hard time now being lauded as, or having a hard time with CDC being lauded as white hats by Joe Mann and even AT&T, which is surprising. When we spent decades being dismissed or vilified as black hats and villains, right? So that's also kind of strange. But.
I mean, there was no even concept of white versus black hat. It was just hackers are bad. It's. I think that's changed a lot now, as you kind of alluded to, with the idea of life hacks and we're hacking this or this kind of hack, and that's great. I mean, like unreservedly, that's great. I think. And Misha, as you also say, kind of now we have, and you describe them as like, cyber criminals or these or gangs and stuff like that. And like, that's a much more accurate way to describe, these groups is like, it's like, okay, maybe they are doing hacking, but that's, but their identity or, how to identify them is not, they are quote unquote hackers. Like it's, they have a goal in mind, and that is to either is usually to make money. I mean, or to achieve some sort of, whether if they're a nation state actor or something like that.
I've been involved in computer security in one form or another since 1983, but it wasn't until about 1998 when you could actually get employed in computer security, right? And that's due in large part to the public perception of hackers and hacking then. And it's also why only a few people in my family are aware of my involvement in CDC or hacking at all. My parents do not know.
Still.
I never told them. They do not know. Mostly because it would be difficult to change the narrative in their heads, right? If I sat them down and told them this, it would be hard for me to convince them the value of what I was doing, or that what I was doing had some kind of moral or ethical compass to it.
You can't just give them the CDC book?
Maybe.
I mean, It's like, you don't have to believe me, Mom. Take it from Joe Man.
All right, well, that's a great transition, actually. That's a perfect segue, because, Misha, I want to talk to you about the kind of the moral aspects of this and the origin of the term hacktivism, which, as you said, is something that you guys came up with. I think you in particular. So what does it mean? What does the term hacktivism mean? You wrote a whole declaration about it. So what were some of the core principles there? And then I'm curious if that declaration was written some time ago. If you were to update that today, would you change anything?
So to me, hacktivism is a policy of hacking, phreaking, creating technology to achieve a political or social goal in support of human rights. But it means, I think generally hacktivism means different things to different people. Since we coined it in the 90s, it's really taken on kind of a life of its own. It certainly has a geopolitical aspect now that it didn't then.
Right.
And even within CDC, we have disagreements about what counts as hacktivism and what doesn't. Some of us believe that denial of service and web defacements can be a permissible kind of civil disobedience. Others in CDC don't. So, I can only tell you what I think hacktivism is. Luke, you probably have some thoughts on this as well.
I think, as Misha sort of alluded to, there are different, it's not like there's a hard and fast encompassing definition, I would say. So the sort of the hacktivism declaration was an attempt by CDC to put something out there that would kind of flesh out this sort of idea and what the concept was. But even then, and ongoing, there are disagreements within the herd as to what is acceptable behavior and what is not. For personally, I think that I view the idea of a denial of service being of a company's website or to achieve an activist goal being no different than, say, chaining yourselves to the doors or chaining the doors shut or something like that. I mean, I view it as a direct sort of corollary, however, or analogy rather. But other people did not necessarily agree with that, and so it's we're not a hive mind. We're a herd.
Well, like activism in general. I mean, define it, right? It's hard to do.
Yeah. So in 1999, we created an offshoot that we called Hactivismo, and so this was a group that included not just hackers but also lawyers and activists. And Oxblood Ruffin, who's a CDC member in particular, was kind of leading this effort, especially to develop tools designed to help dissidents in repressive regimes avoid censorship and surveillance. CDC is very much has always been about the free flow of information. I mean, at heart, we are publishers. We've been publishing things since 1984, so the free flow of information is something very near and dear to all of us. So Hactivismo came out with a bunch of different software. They created Peekabooty, which allowed people to bypass some national firewalls back then. So
sort of a predecessor to Tor. Some of the same people
exactly.
started Tor came out of the Hactivismo movement.
Camera Shy was a steganographic application that allowed people to hide, content within other content. Hactivismo created like one of the first secure instant messaging clients called ScatterChat. So, Hactivismo was I think was very successful. And drew together a group of people who weren't just hackers.
I think. I just wanted to add it ties into something else, because one of the things you mentioned is including lawyers, and one of the people that was involved with Hactivismo was Patrick Ball, who's a human rights. I think he's a lawyer, but he's certainly a human rights activist. But and we hosted him. We actually did a human rights panel, like hackers and human rights at DEF CON, and I think 2000 or maybe 2001. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is, like, Patrick Ball he's a real human rights lawyer, like a real, and so he was actually called as a witness when Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian dictator, was on trial at The Hague.
Right, yeah.
Patrick Ball was called to testify, and Slobodan Milosevic is representing himself. And in court, he stands up, he's like, so Mr. Ball, tell me more about this dead cow cult that you are part of. and I remember us seeing that and be like, okay, that's really freaking weird.
There's video of that too, right?
There's video, and it was all recorded, and but it was this sort of freaky, like, okay, this club that we're in effectively has entered into the real world in a way that we did not foresee. Like, there's one thing, it's like, oh, okay, other people in computers know about us and stuff, not in our name is in the mouth of a genocidal dictator.
Right.
Yeah, you've arrived as a hacktivist group when you're name checked in a war crimes tribunal.
Yeah.
But so going back to Hactivismo, so they released a bunch of really good software, and in at least one case they influenced Tor probably. But I think Hactivismo was kind of also the way that Oxblood and other members of CDC tried to put some guardrails around hacktivism to kind of define it, and that was around the time that CDC proclaimed that, to us, hacktivism includes support for the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So, in that declaration, the United Nations says that, access to information, access to speech, access to privacy, these are all guaranteed human rights, right? And so this, ties really well with CDC being an organization that believes in the free flow of information, right? So, Hactivismo was able to, I think refine kind of the definition of hacktivism, at least to us, right? And so that's why I say that, it's a policy of hacking or creating technology that achieves a political or social goal, but in support of human rights, right? Access to information being one of those.
Yeah, I mean, when I read the declaration, and I thought it was interesting that it called out those specific, national kind of human rights. Not treaties is the wrong word, but
it's almost a treaty. It has not been ratified by many countries. I think there are a few that have ratified it. As far as I know, the United States has not ratified it.
Agreements. I mean,
agreements.
Yeah, that's probably, okay. Thank you. That's probably a good word for it. But it really called that out, and in contrast, you guys have definitely also called out other groups that have like actually taken part in cyber warfare.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about some of that.
Yeah. So I to me, one of the most consequential things that we've ever done as a hacktivist group is that we intervened to prevent a cyber war. So in 1998, a hacktivist group called Legions of the Underground, LOU, declared war against cyber war against Iraq and China, and planned on disabling internet access to those countries in retaliation for human rights abuses there. That was their reason. And we opposed this for numerous reasons. In the hacktivism that we practice, as I said, we support the UN's Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which says you have access to information, and to quote Reed Fleming from Cult of Dead Cow, he said, "One cannot legitimately hope to improve a nation's free access to information by working to disable its data networks," right? So CDC assembled an international coalition of hacker groups and publications like 2600 Magazine, Chaos Computer Club, HISPA Hack, L0pht, and others. And we issued a joint statement to explain why we thought this was dangerous and wrong-headed, and made it clear that if LOU went through with their plan, they would be pariahs. And it worked. LOU kind of called off their action. They didn't attack Iraq or China. And then, so fast forward to 2012, Luke, Reed Fleming, and I are on a panel at one of the premieres of Brian Knappenberger's documentary, We Are Legion, which is about hacktivism and specifically about Anonymous, mostly about Anonymous. So after the panel was over, a member of LOU came up to us who was in the audience, coincidentally in the audience, and he thanked us. He said, "You saved my life."
Wow.
He said, I'm married, I have a family, I have a job now. There was disagreement within LOU about whether we should do this or not. At the time, the go ahead and do it argument was winning. When you guys put out that joint statement, it helped some of us win the argument within LOU. And, he said specifically to us, if we had done that, I think I would be in prison. I wouldn't have the life that I have now. And so that was just an amazing experience to have so that kind of feedback, to sort of see about, what was going on up behind the other side of the screen, and for somebody to come up and tell us about this impact that we had made on.
And it must have been really validating, right? I mean, for the positions you guys had taken, and that's fantastic. That's a really cool story. Wow. Okay, so we're running out of time, but I had so many other questions we didn't even get a chance to get to. But before we get out of here, I wanted to lighten things up a little bit and ask. My theory is that there are people listening to this right now who have latent hacker tendencies that don't know it. And so what I'd be curious to know before we quit is, what are some hacker tendencies that we might have that you think, some tendencies we might have that might mean we're hackers? I was actually thinking in Jeff Foxworthy, I was saying, like, you might be a redneck if, like, you might be a hacker if, that you might not think about. But I think there are people out there that might have some of these proclivities. So, like, for instance, myself, looking back, I didn't really grok this as a kid, but I used to take all my electronics toys apart and I'd put them back together in different ways and find new ways to make them work and do other things. And to me, that was hacking. That was the curiosity, the tinkerer in me that first led me to electrical engineering as a degree, and then onto software. And yet I still missed the true hacker boat that you guys were in. But so looking back at yourselves, maybe, and some of your own experiences, and then obviously the people that you've rubbed elbows with over the years, what were some personality traits or things that might lead you to believe that you might be interested in this as something you want to do? Almost every hacker that I've come across has had at least a passing organic interest in lockpicking. Yeah, right. That is an amazing. All the hacker cons have lockpick villages. Yeah. And I think even more interesting that so now you can go to DEF CON, right? And there's a lockpicking village, and you can get exposed to it there. But before, say, DEF CON, it was interesting to me to realize that in isolation, people that I was meeting who were hackers were also interested in lockpicking, had also managed to get a lockpick set, because it's difficult in some states. In fact, in some states, it's illegal to have a lockpicking set. And it was just, and this is sort of an organic interest in, it's literally, you have a door in front of you that's locked that you want to get through, right? Which is sort of an analogy for hacking, right? There's some kind of challenge in front of you, and you have to figure out how to unlock that, right? And so lockpicking is something that I have seen a lot of people occupied with. Social engineering is another one. So there are some people who are really, really gifted in social engineering and being able to sort of win your confidence over the telephone or even in person, right? And sort of get you to do something or get you to believe something that you otherwise wouldn't. To me, that's a kind of like relationship hacking, or personality hacking.
I always say that, for me, at its like highest level, or at its lowest level, the most basic level, hackers are people who take a system and manipulate it somehow to do things that it was not intended to do. And so that could be a computer system. It could be a locked door. It could be somebody that you're calling on the phone to try to get them to do something. It could be a political system. It could be a human system, a technological system, what have you. So for me, yes, we are computer hackers, but not all hackers are computer hackers. And also it's a mindset that is not, it's not even a modern one, I would say. The example I always use is that I think of, like, Benjamin Franklin was a hacker. Nikola Tesla was a hacker. People who basically looked at the world around them and they're like, okay, what makes this tick? How can I make it do different things, etc. And that's at the most fundamental level, that's how I see it. I think that, talking about things that may indicate that that you're one of those people. Misha talked about social engineering and also lockpicking, and you had spoken about like taking things apart. I have a friend who always described hackers as people who take things apart and put them back together better. But more fundamentally, I think it's that kind of curiosity of like, how do things work? Why do they work? And then trying to apply that to the world that they interact with.
Can this work differently? That's another one.
Yeah.
I think the hacker mindset, you ask questions, whereas that other people take for granted.
Yeah.
And
Right.
And if you bothered to ask some of these questions, you would stumble onto things, right? But I think in even speaking for myself, I often have a failure of imagination about things, right? And then that other people don't. They ask questions about some field that I don't know as well about, and they're able to make more progress because they don't take things for granted that I'm taking for granted.
Yeah. I mean, hackers are at a basic level, they are driven by curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think they ask questions. They ask why a lot more than other people do. And I think that I think that hackers question authority too, and not resist authority necessarily, though it may look that way. I think a lot of people associate hackers with anarchists and anarchy, and I think there certainly is a thread there that you guys could talk to. But I think a lot of it's just questioning authority. It's like, what do you mean I can't do that? Why can't I do that? No, why?
Yeah, and I think it's probably was. I mean, I'm sure it was extremely frustrating for our parents in a lot of cases, but this sort of like. Very much like, I have to understand why you want me to do something or want me to not do something.
Exactly.
Not, just because I say so is not good enough.
Yes.
And as I say, frustrating for parents, but that's the way it is.
To turn that on its head a little bit, some of the success that you can get through social engineering is through what's called the appeal to authority, right? So in this case, you take a hacker who sort of weaponizes how people respond to authority in order to get them to do certain things, right? So like if I call you on the phone and I make you think that I'm from the phone company, right? Then you grant me a certain authority about, what you think phone company people should know or do or be able to ask, for instance, right? So.
Right. Me and my girlfriend in college at the time got into Farm Aid. I'm from Indiana, so Farm Aid was in Indiana. A big concert with a lot of names, and we managed, because she was a writer at the college newspaper, she got a press badge, which is like the lowest possible level badge. There's multiple levels of badges to get in, and we were in the green room, and we're not allowed to leave. She somehow got me one of these too. And we're like, that's backstage, like right over there. And we realized that all the badges were colored, but they were only on one side. So we flipped our badges over, and as you said, we walked in like we owned the place.
Yeah, look confident.
Walk right by with their back, just talking to each other. Yeah, we're walking back, and we just walked right up. And it was the kind of the appeal to the authority. Just pretend like we belonged there, and no one questioned us.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty typical story. Also, talking about something we didn't talk about with hackers and freakers is that physical aspect of going dumpster diving, like going behind the phone central office, or later on, cell phone shops or computer places or whatever, and seeing what they throw away, and especially, probably still, but less so now because things aren't so physical media based, but you would find hard drives, you would find entire computers, you would find documents that might have confidential things that will help you learn about their systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so in many cases, in order to get access to these, where these things are, it is just like looking confident, maybe put on a hard hat and a high vis vest, or carry a clipboard, all this sort of stuff that can get you so that you could sometimes acquire things illegally that you're not meant to have. But just you won't get questioned if you look like you belong, kind of a thing.
Yeah. So I think it's two sides of the same coin. Questioning authority, but also realizing that you can weaponize it in certain ways.
Yeah, and I do think that I was speaking to Misha about this last night, but I want to draw a line. A distinction between the sort of like questioning authority and sort of a knee-jerk contrarianism, because there is this sort of like, I want to know why, but it's not just like, I'm just going to dig in my heels. And especially, I'm not going to dig in my heels and ignore actual evidence. Like, if you give me a real reason, like, okay, that's good for me. I'm not going to be like, no, this is this grand conspiracy by lizard people from space to make us get vaccinated with 5G chips that are going to make Bill Gates control us or what have you.
Oh, that's a whole other podcast. Okay, before we go, but one last question, and that is: there's so many horrible portrayals of hackers in pop culture, particularly in movies and books. So I'm curious: do you guys have any recommendations? Like, if you're going to recommend a movie, like, okay, that is an accurate portrayal of what I consider to be hacking and hackers.
I think what we could actually do, I don't know whether your format allows for this, but this is the kind of thing, we could work up like a reading list or a suggested sources. Cause
I've got show notes. I'll put them all in the show notes.
Oh, great. I mean, cause there's everything from like the movie Sneakers, which is a great portrayal. I think we actually, saw it relatively recently, and I'm amazed by how well it holds up.
Yeah, me too. Yep.
Like you could reshoot it with almost exactly the same script, like without really needing to update almost anything, and it would hold up even 25 years later. To older things like the movie The Conversation with Gene Hackman, which is sort of like a proto hacker thing. And we talked about war games a little bit.
Yeah, war games.
Which is obviously a sensationalized view, but
I would add documentaries. There's a bunch of documentaries that we could name. We could put
go ahead.
Talked about unauthorized access and freedom downtime.
Yeah.
And
so, but you're literally seeing people who are either hackers or practicing hacking, right? As opposed to this cinematic version of it, or what a screenwriter thinks it is.
Although I would say the one fiction depiction that I feel like is the most accurate or the least inaccurate would be Mr. Robot. Especially the first.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, Jeff Moss actually was a consultant on that, right?
Was he? I know that Cyber Junkie, who's his head of the goons for DEF CON and has been for decades, Mark Rogers was the named consultant for season 2, and he told us all these stories about like things where there's they build a cell phone in the show. There's like a cell phone interceptor box, and he talked about that that was a real thing that he built for them. And there's another thing where Mr. Where the
Rami
Malek runs an exploit script, and that was a legit exploit script that Mark had basically built just for the show. And that's, I can't think of another case. Like before that, it would be a big deal if they're like, oh, they're actually using Nmap, or oh, that's actually SSH, as opposed to just this sort of like graphical thing. Yeah. As a graphical, cracking kind of thing. But that was the first show to some, obviously they had to make it more exciting because nobody wants to watch a movie of, sitting around for 18 hours, not sleeping and surviving on Jolt and pizza. But, they did a pretty good job with that.
How about books, Misha? Do you have any books that you recommend?
I think Hacker Crackdown by Bruce Sterling is probably one of the best that I've read. It came out in the early 90s. What's that?
I think 93 or 94. It's about the Operation Sun Devil in 92.
Yeah, which we probably don't have time to get into, but I think that's a really, really good book. Fascinating. It tells you a lot about the Hacker Wars, Legion of Doom, Masters of Deception, some of those things that were going on then.
Hacker Crackdown also sort of marks a sea change in hacker culture because Operation Sun Devil specifically, it kind of broke down a lot of these open lines of communication where it's like, oh, part of the early hacker ethic was like you learn stuff and you share it with all everybody else who wants it, and then that was that thing was essentially weaponized by the feds to
gather evidence,
put people in jail. Yeah.
Joe Men's book.
For sure.
For Joe Men's book. Despite that I'm in the book and Luke's in the book, I think it is really well written. And it's easy when you're writing about this. So much of hacking is hard to depict and hard to explain. So it's really easy for an author to get in to make a lot of mistakes about how they depict this, or to make it so technical that you lose the audience,
Sure.
or so generic that it doesn't even make sense.
Right.
I think Joe did a really good job. I think Bruce Sterling did a really good job in talking about, the technical things about how, what is this happening when you're looking at this screen, and why does it happen that way?
What about I was going to say Cuckoo's Egg?
That's
Cliff
a good one,
Stoles. Yeah,
that's a great
and that
book.
was certainly a big one that we were reading. At the time in the late 80s, that it was like this because it was the book about hackers,
Right.
Yeah.
And his
Yeah.
obsession with figuring out how these systems work. And that also kind of represented the hacker mindset too. He was bound and determined to figure out how all that stuff worked.
It's really an interesting computer forensics story. It's
Right.
really what it is.
Yeah. There's because you talked a little about like the hacker wars, the so-called hacker wars, but there was one that came out in the mid 90s, late 90s, Masters of Deception. I think the Quitners wrote it, and I would not really say it's a good book. There's a lot of stuff that it just kind of gets wrong, but it is, it is interesting. It's a depiction of that sort of early 90s hacker scene, etc. That was sort of us coming into our own as the things started to shift from BBSs and things like that over to the internet. And all of a sudden you could be dealing with systems and people literally all over the world without having to call them directly from your parents' basement.
And shifting from landlines to cellular, lots of different changes there.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, Misha, Luke, this has been fantastic. We could go on for hours and hours, I know, but thank you for coming on the show and sharing your history with us and your thoughts. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Hopefully you got stuff that was interesting to you and your listeners.
Absolutely. Oh man, that was fun. I had such a good time talking with Luke and Misha. That was great. I cannot wait to bring them back on the show. Hopefully we'll get some other folks from CDC or L0pht on the show at some point too. That's just so fun. I hope you enjoyed it too. I know it's very hacker centric, and I know it's maybe for some of you that are not old enough to remember some of the things we were going through. It might seem like a bunch of old guys talking about the old days, and I used to have to walk to school uphill both ways. But I just find it absolutely fascinating. I'm really hoping to see Luke and Misha in Vegas when I'm there. I know they're going to be there. And if I'm really lucky, maybe I'll get to meet some other folks from CDC or L0pht or other groups like Root. I'm hoping that's going to be the case. We shall see. Now, I did chat with the guys after the show, and they put together a little Google worksheet with some of their suggested reading and viewing lists. Now, I'm not going to share their link directly with you guys, but I made a copy of what they had put in there so far and put it in a sheet of my own, and I will share that. If you want to find that, you can go to fdst.me/CDC list. And as they update their list, I will try to periodically come and update my copy of that list. But it's got a list of TV shows and books and movies that they recommend, ones that are either meaningful to them, or the way I asked the question originally, which, is what pop culture references like these actually do a good job of representing hackers and hacking. So that was kind of the flavor, though I don't necessarily think that's behind all of their recommendations. So anyway, check that out if you are interested. Now, for the patrons, I got a whole bunch more from these guys. We kept talking and talking and talking. I probably got another, 30, 40 minutes of chatting with these guys for the patron bonus stuff. That'll come out on Thursday, as usual. We talk about the history of some of the hacker conferences like SummerCon and HoHoCon and PumpCon, what it was like to go to cons back in those days, because, DEF CON's like, 30,000 plus people. And in the old days, it was a few dozen. And the vibe was very, very different. I mean, a lot of it because it was so much smaller, but it was just different. So I thought it was very interesting to get their perspective on that, because they were there. They went to a lot of these back in the day. We also talk about who it was that invented leet speak. And leet speak, if you've ever seen it, this is where hackers oftentimes replace some English letters with numbers in words that they make, like in L0pht, L0pht. But in this case, it was elite. And it was, quote unquote, spelled 31337. So the 3s being E's, the 1 being L, and the 7 being a T. So, and it's not even, so in that sense, it's not even spelled right either. But, that this is the artistic license used by the hackers. So anyway, the Cult of the Dead Cow is actually credited with creating that word. They, as we've already talked about, they are credited with creating the term hacktivism. They have an interesting story about an Agent Steele. We talk about their decision to actually reveal their real names in the Cult of the Dead Cow book. That was a significant decision that they had to make. We talk of probably, arguably anyway, the most famous member of CDC, which you may or may not know is Beto O'Rourke, the Texas politician. We find out how one becomes a member of the CDC, and talk a lot about how you don't have to be a hacker to be in the Cult of the Dead Cow. In fact, many of the folks in CDC are not primarily hackers at all. We also get into the history of the L0pht, which a lot of people think of as another hacker group like CDC or Masters of Deception or Legion of Doom. But originally, L0pht was actually a loft, L-O-F-T. It was a hackerspace. And there's a really kind of interesting, nuanced story behind that. So that's just some of what we get into in the patron bonus content, which will come out on Thursday. So speaking of which, talking about patrons, I've got one of my Dragon Challenge coin promotions going on right now. If you'd like to get one of my super cool security enhancing challenge coins, now is a great time to become a patron. You can go to fdsd.me/promo823, as in August of 2023. Or just go to firewalls.dragons.com and look for the most recent article about challenge coins, and you'll find all the information there. I'm doing this through the end of August. And if you happen to already have one of these puppies in your possession and you will be in Las Vegas, Nevada, maybe we could find each other and you can slap that puppy on the table and I'll buy you a drink. Similarly, if you have some Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons merch, if you're wearing some swag and I see you, I will definitely walk up and introduce myself to you. You can get your merch at fdsd.me/merch. Also looking to see if I see anybody sporting one of my Amulet of Entropy indie badges. Okay, so I am in Vegas as you hear this right now, and so what I'm hoping to do is capture some of the sounds, some of the experiences from Hacker Summer Camp, and bring them to you in the next version of the podcast. I probably won't be doing a new show as normal. I'm going to be doing a DEF CON special, which I, at this point, I'm doing every year. And there usually is big security news at DEF CON. So maybe what I'll be doing is bringing you some of those stories. I'm going to try to record and edit this on my laptop while I am in Vegas and still try to get it out on time on Monday morning. However, there's a more than even chance that will not happen. So I may end up just gathering all the raw footage, I guess, or audio clips, and then editing it once I get home. So it may not come out until Monday night or even Tuesday. So just FYI, next Monday show might be delayed a little bit. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. Hope to see some of you in Vegas, including some of my patrons. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.